Clara clinked her wine glass, standing tall among her friends in our living room. And then she asked if I needed help Googling the recipe. Bless her heart, she still thinks Google is a person. The women erupted in laughter. I stood in the kitchen doorway, holding the lemon tart I'd baked for them. My cheeks burned. My hands didn't shake. They laughed like I was a character in her comedy show, but I was the one holding the curtains up. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Comment below. I wasn't always this quiet. Before I moved into that house, our house, I had a name that meant something in my small Georgia town. Mrs. Lorene McCarthy, third-grade teacher at Pine Hill Elementary for nearly 30 years. I wasn't glamorous or bold, but I was known, trusted. My former students still send Christmas cards, some now with their own children scribbling the signatures. I lived a quiet life with my husband, Paul, in a modest white cottage with a front porch swing and a rose bush that bloomed like clockwork each May. When Paul passed, the silence came in like a flood. He left behind a worn leather journal filled with daily reflections, prayers, stories, little notes to me. Some nights, I'd fall asleep with it on my chest, the pages fluttering softly with the fan. After the funeral, my son David and his wife Clara offered me a room in their brand new home outside Charlotte. "It'll be good for everyone," Clara had said brightly. "We could use the help with the baby, and it's silly for you to be alone." They had just closed on a craftsman-style home in a pristine gated neighborhood. I remember the day we signed the deed. David held my hand and said, "Mom, this is your home too. We couldn't have done this without you." I had sold the cottage, liquidated my savings, and offered it all, nearly $180,000, toward the down payment. At the lawyer's office, he insisted I be added to the deed. "Just to be fair," he said. I nodded, thinking little of it. Fairness wasn't something I had learned to expect, but it was something I quietly believed in. The first few months were peaceful. I took over the kitchen, which Clara openly welcomed at first. "You're a lifesaver," she'd said, sipping her coffee while I fried eggs and cut fruit for her. I watched the baby while she took work calls. I folded laundry. I changed diapers. I planted a few herbs outside the kitchen window. In the sea. Evenings, I stayed in my room or read to my grandson while Clara and David watched Netflix in the den. I didn't want to overstep. I knew how it felt to be a young wife trying to set a rhythm in your home. Still, there were moments, small at first. I remember when Clara asked me, in front of guests, "Could you make yourself scarce around 6? We're having friends over, and it might be easier." She smiled politely, but her eyes said, "I don't want you here." I nodded. "Of course, honey." From then on, whenever they had company, I stayed upstairs. I'd eat early and listen to the laughter downstairs, like a distant party I was never invited to. But I loved my grandson, and for him, I stayed. He'd reach for me in the mornings, still warm in his footy pajamas, and whisper "Nana" into my neck like a prayer. I baked, I rocked him to sleep, I kept the house running like a quiet little engine behind the walls. I ignored the strange looks Clara gave when I folded the towels differently, or how she would rewash dishes I had already cleaned, or when she laughed and said, "She still uses paper checks at the store." I let it slide when she sighed loudly when I told a story. Or how she never once said, "Thank you," when I stayed home with the baby while they went on weekend retreats. But over time, something in me began to fold in on itself. I started keeping more to myself. I'd journal like Paul did, sometimes, writing letters I'd never send. I missed being needed, not just used. I missed being seen without being scrutinized. At church, people used to listen when I spoke. Here, I felt like a ghost wearing a name tag that said, "Nuisance." The worst part? David had changed too. My boy, who once wrote me handmade birthday cards and cried at his father's funeral like a boy half his age, now only grunted greetings and nodded through conversations. I know Clara filled his ears in the quiet moments between them. I could feel her edits shaping his silence. Still, I made excuses for both of them. Until that night. The night when laughter turned into shame, and Clara turned me into a punchline. In front of strangers drinking wine I'd bought in a house I'd helped build. That was when everything in me, the mother, the wife, the quiet little engine, sputtered, then stopped. She asked me to please stay in the background when guests come, so I did, until the background swallowed me whole. The thing about slow disrespect is, it doesn't show up with a loud bang. It drips. A sideways glance here, a tightening. Of the mouth there. 1,000 little drops wearing down your dignity until one day you realize your name doesn't echo in the house anymore. It just evaporates. Clara didn't start as cruel. Just polished, calculated. Everything about her had a curated shine. The way she decorated the house with minimalist grays and designer throw pillows, the way she introduced herself at the club as a consultant in creative media, whatever that meant. She was the kind of woman who carried herself like the room was lucky to have her, and in those early days, I think she did try. She let me bake, she nodded through my stories, she even bought a rocking chair for the nursery and said, "This can be your spot." But over time, I became a smudge on her otherwise perfect canvas. She'd reorganize the pantry after I stocked it. "We just have a system," she'd say sweetly. My red gingham tablecloths disappeared, replaced with sleek white runners and glass coasters I didn't know how to clean without scratching. One day I found my spice jars boxed up in the garage, labeled miscellaneous. I didn't ask. I just took them out, washed them, and lined them back up in the cabinet. The next day they were gone again. David, my son, he didn't notice. Or maybe he pretended not to. When I asked him about the check that went missing from my desk drawer, he rubbed his eyes and said, "Clara probably just filed it somewhere. She handles all the paperwork now." My name stopped being on the mail. Then my mail stopped arriving altogether. She'd host these book club nights where women with glossy hair and matching handbags would pour into the house with wine bottles and loud voices. The first time, I offered to make a peach cobbler. Clara paused, smiled thinly, and said, "That's so sweet, but maybe we'll keep it more contemporary tonight." I nodded and went back upstairs. They laughed so hard that night I could hear them over my audiobook. At one point, I went down to grab my tea kettle, and someone asked Clara, "Oh, is this the lady who makes the Bible cookies?" Clara giggled. "She means scripture cookies. Yes. She has a whole drawer full of old clippings from church potlucks. It's adorable. Adorable. That's the word you use for a lost puppy, not someone who paid for half the walls you're standing between." But I stayed quiet. I busied myself in the garden, though even that became a problem. Clara said lavender. Clashed with the aesthetic. She wanted drought-tolerant plants for a more curated look. One day, she yanked out the rosemary bush I planted and replaced it with decorative white stones. I cried. Not because of the plant, but because it was the one I'd brought from my old home. Paul planted it with me the spring before he passed. Its roots had followed me across state lines. Now they were in a trash bag by the curb. Then came the nanny, she. "Just needs help while I'm working," Clara said. But I knew. That job was mine. I was the one who rocked him through colic nights, who hummed hymns when the world got too loud. The nanny, young, efficient, robotic, took over the nursery, like I'd been laid off. It wasn't long after that when Clara started dropping comments about generational clutter and phasing out old habits. She didn't say my name, but I heard it in every syllable. Even the baby started calling the nanny Mama. Once, and Clara laughed like it was a party trick. My heart broke so quietly, even I didn't hear it at first. David stayed gone more and more. When he was home, he buried himself in screens. I tried to talk to him once, to ask if everything was okay, and he just mumbled, "Let Clara handle things, Mom. You worry too much." No, I didn't worry too much. I noticed too much. There's a difference. One night, I found an old envelope in the drawer where I kept the deed copy. It had been opened, my name scribbled out on the return address, replaced with Clara's. Inside was a letter from the HOA, something about shared property rules. I hadn't even known about it. But Clara had. She just didn't think I needed to. That's when I realized I wasn't a person in this house anymore. I was furniture, quiet, useful, moved around as needed, but never once asked if I wanted to be part of the design. I tried, Lord knows I tried. I showed up, I cleaned, I comforted. I bent every edge of myself to fit their mold. But people like Clara don't make space. They erase and replace, and I'd given her the pen. She said, "Let's not bring your country quilts into the sitting room. It's not the aesthetic." I folded them. I also folded something deeper inside me. You don't notice a storm's full weight until the roof starts leaking. Clara's whispers began as background noise, little flicks of sarcasm she'd toss over her shoulder when her friends came by. But by spring, the whispers turned into open declarations. I walked into the kitchen one morning and overheard her on the phone. I swear, it's like living with a time capsule. "Everything smells like cinnamon and mothballs." She didn't lower her voice. She wanted me to hear it. David sat at the kitchen island with his coffee, eyes glued to his phone. He didn't say a word, didn't even flinch. That was the moment. I understood I was no longer being excluded. I was being erased. It started with the mail. Mine vanished completely. When I asked, Clara gave a tight smile. "You probably signed up for everything with your old address." That didn't make sense. I had changed it all over when I moved in. But I didn't argue. Next came the bookshelf. I had kept a row of old hymnals and classic novels in the hallway cabinet. One morning they were gone. In their place were glass, sculptures shaped like question marks, and a stack of glossy books titled things like "Manifest Your Power." I found my books in a donation box in the garage, wedged between a broken coffee maker and baby toys. The final straw came one afternoon, when I returned home from the market and found my bedroom door wide open. Clara was standing inside, rearranging furniture. "Just trying to open the space a bit," she said lightly. It was starting to feel cramped. She had taken down my framed wedding photo. I found it leaning against the wall, face down. "You could have asked," I said gently. She raised an eyebrow. "It's not like this is your space." I looked her straight in the eye then. "Half this house is mine. You know that." She laughed, a low, mocking sound. "You really think a piece of paper makes this your home? Come on." David came home late that night. I didn't tell him what happened. I wanted to, but the man who once stood up to a teacher for calling me just a housewife wasn't there anymore. He'd become a shadow version of himself, always tired, always unavailable. And then came the party. Clara was hosting a mixer for some of her new networking friends, other women who seemed to live in Instagram posts and scented perfection. She asked if I could stay upstairs after 6. "I'll leave dinner on the stove," I said quietly. That night, I stood at the top of the stairs with the lights off. I wasn't eavesdropping. I just couldn't sleep. I heard Clara say, "She still writes checks, can you imagine? And she thinks the baby formula is too scientific." I told her, "This isn't 1982, Nana." Laughter erupted. Glasses clinked. Someone imitated a southern accent, my accent. She blesses. Everything, y'all. Burnt toast? Bless it. Stubbed toe? Bless it. It's like living with a country preacher who never shuts up. More laughter. I felt a tear run down my cheek, not because of the insult, I've been called worse, but because I realized I had become entertainment in a house I helped build. I returned to my room, sat on the bed, and stared at my hands. Those hands once braided my son's hair, pressed cool cloths to fevered foreheads, and buried the man who taught me how to love with grace. Now they were nothing but old props in someone else's stage show. The next day, things escalated. I noticed all of my personal items in the kitchen: my favorite mug, my spice rack, my worn cutting board had been replaced with uniform, unlabeled items. Clara had created her perfect minimalist dream, erasing every trace of my presence. When I reached for my own tea canister, it was gone. I walked out to the garage where Clara was stacking donation boxes. "Did you see my kitchen things?" She didn't even turn to look at me. They didn't match the rest of the space. "This is my house too," I said, my voice low. She turned then, finally meeting my eyes. "It's our house, but only one of us still lives in the present." That night, while they watched a documentary in the living room, I went into my room and unlocked the hope chest where I kept Paul's journal, my wedding ring, and, most importantly, the certified copy of the deed. I hadn't looked at it in over a year, but now I studied the fine print. My name, clearly listed, half owner, equal rights. The tears that came weren't of sadness, they were clarity. I laughed with them politely. Then I went to my room, closed the door, and for the first time in 15 years, I called my old lawyer. It's strange what you remember when the world starts shifting beneath your feet. Not the big milestones or bold decisions, but the smallest things, like the way Paul used to hum while washing dishes, always off-key but steady. Or the handwritten notes. He'd leave in my purse, lunch money, and a kiss if you're reading this. Or how we agreed, the day David was born, that no matter what life brought, we'd never let him feel alone. I held on to that promise, even after Paul passed. I held it like an anchor, even when it became heavy, especially when it became heavy. Talk hey. Night, I called my lawyer. I sat in my room holding Paul's old journal in my lap. The leather had cracked from years of use. Inside, his voice lived on in curling ink. "Don't ever let them forget you built the bricks they now stand on." He wrote that after David graduated college. I'd worked double shifts as a substitute for years just to get us through. Paul. Never let me doubt my worth, not once. And now, here I was, sidelined in a house my own money helped purchase, mocked like a relic, replaced in my grandson's heart by someone paid by the hour. That kind of ache. It doesn't roar. It sits like stone in your stomach. I remembered a moment not long after I moved in. Clara had found my jewelry box open on the dresser. She picked up my old pearl brooch, the one my mother gave me on my wedding day, and asked, "This real?" I nodded. She laughed and said, "Kind of vintage tacky, but cute." I never wore it again. I remembered how, when the house was being renovated, I offered to pick out the tiles for the downstairs bath. Clara paused, smiled, then said, "Maybe sit this one out. It's a modern design. Don't want to get it confused with a Cracker Barrel." That memory stayed with me more than I like to admit. But the moment that broke me didn't come in a scream. It came in the form of laughter. That night, the book club night, I had baked lemon tart. Clara's favorite. I arranged it on the counter and went back upstairs before her guests arrived. But I heard it all through the floorboards. She mimicked me. Voice high, dripping with faux innocence. "Oh, honey, do you need help logging in? Just hit the magic button and pray." The women howled. Someone yelled, "She's a riot." "She blesses everything," Clara added. "She even blessed the vacuum cleaner last week." They didn't know I was listening. That's what made it worse. It wasn't just what they said. It was what it cost them to say it. Nothing. It cost me everything to hear it. I stood at the top of the stairs, holding onto the banister like it might stop my body from collapsing inwards. This wasn't just unkindness. This was displacement. A word I'd once taught my students in class. How a body is moved when something else takes up the space it once held. I didn't belong there anymore, and they were making sure I knew it. I stayed up that night reading through Paul's journal again. Near the back, in a shaky hand from the last year of his life, he'd written, "If the day comes when the kindness you give is returned with silence, leave the room. Don't slam the door, but never stay invisible." The next morning, I moved. Like I always did, quiet, routine, invisible. I fed the baby, folded the laundry, even made Clara's oat milk latte the way she liked it. No one suspected a thing. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my church friend, Sharon, whose guest room I had once helped paint after her husband passed. "I might need that room for a few nights," I said. She said it was already made. The second was to Mr. Stanley, my old lawyer from Augusta. He'd helped Paul and me revise our wills, and I trusted him with the things I didn't even trust myself to feel. By noon, he had emailed me the paperwork for a notice of intent to sell shared property. It was like drawing a map out of a maze. The lines were thin but solid. After lunch, I went to my hope chest and retrieved the deed, half ownership in legal print. Clara had underestimated me. She saw an apron, a bun, a woman who said, "Bless it," too many times. What she didn't see was the woman who once negotiated with school board officials to keep her students from losing their library. The woman who budgeted an entire household on a teacher's salary and still saved enough to co-purchase a $400,000 home. The woman who raised a son through 2 recessions and a war. I wasn't a relic. I was the roots beneath the tree she perched in. Have you ever been hurt by someone you helped the most? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. I smiled through the shame. Then, while the dishwasher hummed behind me, I retrieved the house deed from my hope chest. The morning I left, the sun rose soft and pale, like it was doing me a favor by not burning too bright. I made breakfast the same way I always did. Steel-cut oats for Clara, with half a banana and a sprinkle of flaxseed. 2 scrambled eggs and toast for David, even though he'd barely touch it. And fruit for the baby, sliced into little crescent moons. I moved through the kitchen like a woman not carrying a secret. Calm hands, quiet breath. I kissed my grandson on the forehead and whispered, "Be good to yourself, even when others aren't." He was too young to understand, but his tiny arms wrapped around my neck, and that was enough. I placed a note on the counter, folded once. "Don't worry. The house won't be your problem much longer." Then I rolled my single suitcase through the front door, shut it behind me without a sound, and walked toward freedom like I'd rehearsed it in dreams. Sharon's house sat just 30 minutes away, but it felt like another world. Her guest room smelled of lavender and wood polish. A handmade quilt, my quilt, one I'd gifted her years ago, was spread across the bed. It felt like being remembered. That first night, I slept like I hadn't in months. No tension in my shoulders, no hushed voices down the hall, no sense of tiptoeing inside a life that refused to make room for me. In the morning, I made coffee and sat on Sharon's back porch, watching birds argue over seeds. I let the quiet in. Not the kind I'd been used to, the hollow silence of being dismissed, but a peaceful quiet, a healing quiet. I checked my email. There it was, a message from Mr. Stanley with the subject line, "Notice delivered, next steps." He'd mailed the legal notice that morning, registered signature required. The document outlined my legal right to sell my portion of the home, or demand a buyout at market value. Clara wouldn't be able to sweep this under any decorative rug. I reread the email 3 times. My fingers trembled, not with fear, but with release. I wasn't doing this to hurt them. I was doing this to remember myself. Back at Sharon's, I helped her with odds and ends around the house. I polished the silver, sorted old church bulletins, even helped bake a peach cobbler for her neighbor recovering from surgery. It felt good to help again, not because someone expected it, but because it was received with gratitude, not entitlement. On the 3rd day, David called. I didn't answer. Then Clara called. 5 times. Left 2 voicemails. Her voice, usually sugar-coated, now cracked at the edges. Hey, so, we got your letter. I don't really understand what this is. You left without even saying anything. I mean, we didn't even know you were upset. I closed my eyes. That's the thing with people like Clara. They don't notice the fire until the smoke gets in their eyes, and even then, they blame the match, not the hands that struck it. That evening, Sharon and I took a walk down her lane, past tall pines and azaleas blooming in bursts of fuchsia and coral. She didn't ask questions, she just walked beside me. Sometimes, that's all healing needs, someone to walk beside you in silence without filling it. When we got back, I took out my own journal and wrote, I didn't scream. I didn't throw plates. I didn't beg. I left with grace and a lawyer. I allowed myself a small smile, a first smile, one that belonged only to me. That week, I applied to volunteer at the local library, helping seniors learn to use technology. When the librarian asked if I had experience, I chuckled and said, only a lifetime's worth. She hired me on the spot. Each little step brought me back to myself, my rhythm, my voice. Then came the 6th day. Clara left a voicemail that wasn't angry or fake sweet. It was panicked. You're trying to sell the house? You can't do that. This will ruin everything. What are we supposed to do? We have a mortgage, and you know David's job has been shaky. I didn't respond. Not yet. She still hadn't said the words that mattered. I'm sorry. Not for what she did, not for how she made me feel invisible. But the silence was doing its work. For once, it was mine. I hadn't found resolution yet, but I had found relief, and that was a beginning. That afternoon, she called me 13 times. I didn't answer, but the legal notice did. At first, I thought they'd ignore it, brush it off like everything else I'd ever said, ever given, ever been. But people like Clara don't know what to do when a woman like me doesn't yell, Chase doesn't explain. She expected fury. She got paperwork. By the end of the week, David showed up at Sharon's door. He looked older, tired in a way he hadn't been before. Hair unbrushed, shirt wrinkled, eyes swollen from too many sleepless nights or too many arguments, maybe both. He didn't step inside, just stood on the porch, shifting from foot to foot like a boy asking permission. Mom, he started, voice barely above a whisper. Can we talk? I looked at him, really looked. My son, the boy I raised with bedtime stories and brown bag, lunches, the man who now couldn't look me in the eye. We can talk here, I said. He rubbed his hands together. Clara's freaking out. We didn't know you felt this way. I tilted my head. You didn't know? Or you didn't care to ask? He opened his mouth, closed it. The silence between us pulsed like a wound. She's scared. Mom, he continued, this could ruin us. We can't afford to buy you out. Not right now. I nodded. I understand, but I'm not staying in a home where I'm mocked and minimized. He shook his head, frustrated. She's stressed, okay? She's under a lot of pressure. So was I said, evenly. You just didn't notice. He didn't respond, just lowered his eyes and said, we didn't mean for it to get like this. That was the closest thing to an apology I got that day. But it wasn't enough. I'm not angry, I said, but I am done. He nodded as if trying to absorb the shape of that word. Done. Later that day, Sharon handed me her iPad. You might want to see this. There was a pause. I was thinking, maybe Henry could come visit you. He misses you. My throat tightened. Of course, I said, swallowing the tears. Whenever you both are ready. Henry came the following weekend. He ran up the porch, steps like he remembered every inch of me. Nana, he shouted, throwing his little arms around my waist. I knelt down and kissed his cheek. I missed you more than peaches miss summer, baby. We baked snickerdoodles and planted tomatoes. In the backyard. I taught him how to mix biscuit dough by hand and how to tell when cornbread's done just by listening to the crust crackle. He called me Nana 12 times that day. I counted every one. David picked him up in the evening. He lingered at, the door, eyes darting around the house. You fixed it up nice, he said. I just let it be what it is, I replied. He looked down. Clara's been quiet, different. She knows what she did, even if she can't say it yet. I don't need her to, I said gently. That apology isn't for me anymore. It's for her. He nodded and turned to leave. Before stepping, off the porch, he said, You're happier here, huh? I smiled. I'm me here. Since then, I've started teaching part-time again, just a few hours a week at the library, helping senior citizens navigate smartphones and email. Funny, isn't it? The woman who once asked if Google was a person is now helping others find their voice in a digital world. But that's the thing about being underestimated. It gives you room to rise unnoticed. The women at church asked me to speak at the spring luncheon. I told my story, not in anger, but in strength. I told them about how dignity doesn't have to shout, and how sometimes walking away is the loudest thing you'll ever do. One woman cried. Another hugged me and whispered, My daughter-in-law treats me like a stranger. I thought I was the only one. No, ma'am, you're not. I still get the occasional text from Clara, formal, guarded. She asks how Henry is doing after his visits. I answer kindly, but I don't offer anything more. That boundary is no longer a wall. It's a gate, and I decide when it opens. As for David, we're better. Not perfect, but better. He visits sometimes, brings Henry with him, and once in a while helps me carry firewood or hangs a picture frame. He hasn't said thank you, but he also hasn't asked me to go back. That's enough for now. I sit on my porch most evenings with a cup of mint tea and a quilt over my knees. I listen to the wind chime I hung by the door, the same one Clara boxed away like it didn't belong. It sings now, loud and clear. Would you have walked away, or stayed and endured? Let me know. Below, the house was gone. The pain was fading. But the lesson, that stayed with all of us forever. I think people believe strength always looks like shouting, marching out with bags flying and doors slamming, grand exits, red faces, high drama. But the strongest thing I ever did was pack a single suitcase, write a quiet note, and leave without raising my voice. Because strength isn't about making someone see your worth. It's about remembering it yourself, especially when no one else seems to. Looking back now, I see all the moments I allowed myself to shrink just to keep the peace. How I folded my voice into a smaller shape so theirs could echo louder. How I laughed when it hurt, stayed when I was lonely, gave even when nothing was being poured back into me. But I don't blame myself. Love teaches us to sacrifice, but wisdom teaches us when to stop. It took losing a house to gain a home. It took being mocked to remember my own voice, and it took Clara's dismissal for me to finally stop dismissing myself. I don't hate her. I don't even wish her harm. I wish her growth. I wish her the kind of self-awareness that can only come from watching everything you thought you controlled slip out of your hands. Maybe she'll never apologize. Maybe she still tells a version of the story where I'm the villain who wrecked their lives. That's fine. I didn't survive this to be remembered. I survived this to feel whole. Paul used to say, "Some silences thunder louder than any scream." He was right. When I left that house, I didn't leave empty-handed. I took my dignity. I took the lessons. I took my grandson's laughter and the scent of rosemary and the feeling of waking up in a room that loves me back. That's more than enough to any woman listening, especially those in your golden years who feel like your worth is tied to your usefulness, hear me when I say this. You are not a burden. You are not background noise. You are the foundation someone else is standing on, and you have every right to walk away from the ones who forgot that. I don't need Clara's praise. I don't need David's guilt. I have my own name, my own key, and a wind chime singing soft hymns every evening, reminding me, you did right by yourself, and that's a life worth living. A post on Clara's curated Instagram page, gone, deleted. Her perfectly arranged flat lays, her inspirational captions, her smiling brunch selfies, all scrubbed. Word had gotten out. Someone from her book club had quietly passed the story along about the elderly mother-in-law forced to leave the home she helped pay for, about the legal notice, about the disrespect. It had started circulating in her little professional network, not because I told anyone, but because truth has a way of seeping. Through even the thickest walls of image, a mutual acquaintance reached out to Sharon. They're saying Clara tried to push her own husband's mother out. Bad optics. Optics. That's what it came down to for Clara. Not people, not pain. Optics. I received a message the next day. Voicemail. Her voice was high, brittle. Hi. So, I'd like to talk. Maybe clear the air. We can work something out, right? Maybe you can just come home and we can set some boundaries. I mean, lawyers? Really? There it was. The pivot. The attempt to wrap her insult in civility. But still, no, I'm sorry. No ownership, just damage control. I didn't respond. That same afternoon, David called again. I picked up. Can we meet? He asked. This time I agreed. We met at the mediation office, neutral ground. Clara walked in late, wearing all black like it was a funeral. Her lips were tight, face puffy, no makeup this time. Lorene, she said, nodding politely, voice drained of all charm. Clara. The mediator, a soft-spoken woman named Joyce, began outlining the terms. I had the right to sell my share or force a full sale. I was within every legal right. David looked at me, eyes pleading. Please, can we fix this without tearing everything apart? I looked at them both carefully, like a teacher addressing two failing students. I asked for respect, not control. Not luxury, just dignity. Neither of them spoke. You asked me to stay in the background. I did. You asked me to disappear. I did. And now you're asking me to undo the only thing that finally made you notice me. Clara's voice cracked. We didn't think you'd actually do this. I smiled, softly. That's what happens when you mistake quiet for weak. Outside the office, they stood side by side. For the first time, I didn't feel small next to them. I felt grounded, whole. Clara opened her mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to plead, but I turned and walked away. The legal process had begun. It would take time, but my part was done. I had spoken. Not with volume, but with value. Back at Sharon's, I made tea, turned on some old Patsy Cline, and sat by the window, watching the light fade over the treetops. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired, but tired in a good way, like after a long day, of finally saying what needed to be said. She said, "This is going to ruin us." I whispered back to the silence. It already did. They called 3 times that next week, once from Clara's number, twice from David's. I let them ring. The papers had been filed. My lawyer assured me the process was clean and strong. Either they bought me out at market value, or the house would be sold and the proceeds split evenly. At this point, it wasn't about the money. It was about memory. Mine, and how I refused to let it be rewritten by someone who thought Southern grace was the same thing as surrender. The storm truly began on the 8th day after the notice. David showed up again, alone this time. We sat on Sharon's porch, facing each other with lemon tea and a stretch of silence between us. His shoulders were hunched, like the weight he'd once ignored was finally catching up. I read the deed again, he said. It's all legal. Clean. I don't know why I'm surprised. I remember the day we signed it. You were so insistent on doing things the right way. I nodded. Paul always said, if you build something right, it holds, even when people forget why it matters. He stared at his hands. I don't know what to do, Mom. I reached out, placed my fingers gently over his. Start by not asking me to undo it. He blinked, clearly stunned. I'm not coming back, David, and I'm not taking back what I've done. I gave you everything I had, my time, my care, my savings. All I asked in return was a place at the table. You both offered me a seat, then laughed while pulling out the chair. He swallowed hard. Clara's lost her job. She was up for a promotion. But after the story got around, they let her go. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. But I also didn't flinch. And what about you? I asked. What have you lost? He hesitated. My peace. My son doesn't ask for you anymore. The house feels heavy now, like it's watching us. That part hurt, but I held it. Held it like I'd held every other pain since I moved in with them. I don't wish you harm, I said. But I do wish you understanding. And sometimes those things grow from the same root. A few days later, mediation resumed. We met in a glass-walled room with too much air conditioning and not enough kindness. Clara came dressed sharply again, a navy blouse buttoned too tight and a notepad clutched like armor. I'm not buying. Her out, she said flatly. She can't just walk away with half our house. The mediator glanced at the documents. Actually, she can. Or you can list it jointly. Those are your legal options. Clara exhaled sharply. This is absurd. She's doing this out of spite. I finally spoke. No, Clara, if this were about spite, I would have stayed and made your life unlivable. But I left quietly. I let you mock me in peace. And now I'm simply asking for what's mine. You abandoned your family, she snapped. I smiled, calm. No, I removed myself from harm. David looked between us, two women who'd once tried to share a life and instead built a war of subtle wounds. I want to sell the house, he said suddenly. Clara whipped her head toward him. What? I'm done living in a place where guilt sleeps in every room. We'll start over somewhere else. Smaller, simpler, we'll figure it out. That silence afterward was the deepest one yet. Clara didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat back and looked at me like for the first time she saw me as something other than a ghost in her narrative. The process moved fast after that. The house was listed. Market interest was strong. Within weeks, a young couple placed an offer, full asking price. The night the sale went through, I went to see the house one last time. Sharon drove me. I stood outside, not to go in, not to rehash, but just to remember. The garden bed I once planted had been replaced with white gravel. My wind chime was gone. The rosemary bush, long since uprooted. But the bricks, the windows, the bones? Still. There, still partly mine. I didn't knock. I didn't even park. I just looked, nodded once, and let it go. Back at Sharon's, I sat with my tea and her kind silence and realized I had something Clara never would. Peace that didn't depend on perfection. The house was gone, but I was still here. Not erased, not forgotten, restored. In that sterile office, I left them to choke on their silence. I carried my dignity like a torch. The day the house officially sold, I received a wire transfer into my account, $226,000. I stared at the number for a long time. It wasn't just money, it was proof. Proof that I wasn't a guest in their story. I had always been a co-author. They just didn't like the way I wrote. I took a deep breath and closed the laptop. Then I walked outside into the crisp morning, barefoot on the dew-covered grass behind Sharon's house. I tilted my face toward the sun and said softly, "Thank you, Paul, for making me keep the deed." That same afternoon, I signed a lease on a modest lake cottage just outside of town. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a sloping porch, white shutters, and an actual fireplace. The kind of place where the floor creaks when it's cold, and the kitchen still has room for a rocking chair. It wasn't just mine. It was me. I moved in slowly, deliberately. Every piece I unpacked felt like an act of reclaiming. The floral teacups Clara had once called Grandma Clutter, now rested proudly in an open cabinet. My quilts, those country blankets she banished to the garage, hung over the banister and across the guest bed. Each room held a breath of memory, but none of them held regret. A few weeks later, I got a call from David. "Hey, Mom," he said. "I wanted you to know we closed on a new place. Smaller, out in the suburbs." "That's good," I said. "Fresh starts can be good."